Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's conversation on paths to a clean energy future. We know the world needs more energy, but how do we deliver it without accelerating climate change? That's the challenge at the heart of today's conversation. My name is Lindsay Anderson, and I'm a professor of biological and environmental engineering at Cornell and a senior faculty fellow with the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. My research program focuses on the technical challenges of power system decarbonization, so I'm especially delighted to moderate this important conversation with our two fantastic speakers today. First, we have Kasparis Spokas, who's the Director of Electricity at Clean Air Task Force, a global nonprofit working to accelerate the development and deployment of low-carbon energy and other climate-protecting technologies. Their mission is to make sure innovation doesn't just stay in the lab, it gets out into the world where it can make a real impact. Our second panelist is Tobias Hanrath, Kroll Professor of Sustainable Energy Systems in the College of Engineering at Cornell and Director of the Cornell Energy Transition Initiative and a faculty fellow with Cornell Atkinson. Kasparis, Tobias, and I are all engaged in partnerships that Cornell Atkinson catalyzes to advance real-world solutions for the energy transition. Their complementary perspectives are sure to provide an exciting conversation, so let's get started. Let's start with the big picture. Decarbonization is often framed as an electricity challenge, but energy systems also include heat, fuels, and materials. If we only optimize for electrons and neglect molecules and heat, we make the transition harder than it needs to be. So for both of you, when we think about the fact that much of the transition, the mainstream narrative focuses on renewables and electrification, from your perspective, what are the critical elements that we are missing in this conversation?
Sure. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thanks for Cornell for organizing this. I think you're right that overall, in the mainstream, there's been a lot of attention on renewable energy, battery storage. And I think rightfully so, there's been a lot of progress in reducing the costs of wind, solar. There's been a lot of cost reduction in battery storage technologies today. And so I think it's worth celebrating some of the wins, that we've had over the last couple decades. But as you mentioned, I think that is still a pretty narrow slice of the overall challenge that we have accomplished so far. I think there's a misconception that now that we have these technologies, progress is simply a matter of political will. And that's a little bit detached from the reality on the ground here. We have one bucket of challenges, which is now that we have new technologies like wind, solar, batteries, we have new demand response technologies and so on, there are a number of layered and complicated processes by which these solutions go through to be deployed. And we're facing various types of speed challenges with deploying these regarding permitting, siting, transmission planning, interconnection, you name it. So there are a lot of kind of difficult challenges there that we need to resolve as a collective group. And then the second bucket of challenges is that we still don't have the full suite of technologies necessary to decarbonize the full energy system at an affordable cost, reliably, and at a pace that is commensurate with some of our climate targets. And so I think, there are some real challenges that require innovation, policy, that go far beyond just political will. So again, let's celebrate the wins, but we still have a far way to go.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah. Tobias, you want to weigh in
One
on
other
that?
thing to add to that, and you mentioned that, said it nicely in terms of energy not just being an issue of electricity, but I think it's very important to recognize that almost half of the energy usage is towards heating, especially in a building context. So if the discussion focuses solely on electrifying, I think there's a big aspect that's missed in terms of how the heating challenges and the cooling challenges are addressed. It's not just a matter of electrifying things and setting up a bunch of PV panels, but you got to keep the buildings heated and cooled. And I think that's something. On the one hand, maybe it's not as sexy of a technology as lithium-ion batteries or photovoltaics, but from an energy balance perspective, every bit as important. And I think in the past couple of years, in terms of the wins that you've talked about, that's a sort of the aspect of integrating district heating, for example, those things are not necessarily as fancy, but I think there's significant opportunities there with significant prospects for decarbonization.
Well, and I think, also if you electrify all your thermal needs, right, you're adding more stress to the system that we're trying to, transition already. So any way that we can break that up, right, to sort of distribute the load in terms of energy is going to be really smart. Yeah. All right. So Kasparis, just quick question. What is the biggest bottleneck that you would solve today if you could? Wave a magic wand.
Yeah, it's really challenging. The energy system generally evolves through a cascade of layered decisions, whether it's planning, regulatory oversight, siting, and permitting. And so, I'm not sure there's one bottleneck that really unlocks speed and scale. I do think there is getting a little bit more granular and a little bit more practical about some of the challenges that we face outside of technology costs with respect to planning and integrating, across different sectors, which historically we haven't done, I think would do a lot to just move towards a much more integrated approach to energy system decarbonization that proactively foresees some of the bottlenecks, that we're facing today.
Yeah, that would be a great magic wand to wave. Yeah. And so, Tobias, coming back to your comment about the thermal, what do you think would be the biggest win on thermal integration?
I think in terms of thermal integration, decarbonizing heating is a huge opportunity space for improvements in terms of achieving that through things like earth source heating. For example, the sort of initiatives here at Cornell with the borehole observatory, trying to figure out how to do that in the northeast of the U.S., which hasn't received as much attention as other places, and then integrating that with sort of district level heating systems. I think there's lots of prospects there. So.
That sounds great. Okay, so we sort of talked about electrification a little bit, so let's dig into electrification and load growth for a little while. So electrification has obviously always been a key component of decarbonization, and almost every decarbonization strategy, has electrification sort of as a centerpiece. But the timing and concentration of new loads coming on from AI, from data centers and advanced manufacturing are really changing the game here. So with the growth of AI, data centers, and widespread electrification driving unprecedented load growth, do you see this as a stress point for the grid, a test, or is it an opportunity to innovate, or both? Kasparis, you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, I think we see it as both. As you mentioned, electricity demand growth was always part of the strategy. Energy system models generally saw a lot of opportunities for electrification, met up with clean supply of electricity as a decarbonization vector. In that were also a lot of interesting efficiency benefits that would just make the system much more efficient than we have it today. I do think some of this near-term load growth that we're experiencing today from data centers and other resources was a little bit unexpected in terms of scale, concentration, pace. Now, I will say there's a lot of uncertainty in these load forecasts, but generally, this is definitely a test of, can we build clean electricity at a pace that can sustain these types of growth rates? Because ultimately, at some point in the future, if electrification takes off, as was hoped in a lot of these pathway models, that type of pace is going to have to be sustained. And so I think we have to really make sure we're balancing things like ratepayer costs, making sure we're exhausting all of the solutions that are available before a decision to build a new gas plant is made, and slowly but surely evolve our systems in terms of how quickly we can deploy clean energy infrastructure that will have long-term benefits, even just beyond this near-term blip of load growth. On the other side, I agree. I think there are a lot of opportunities. I mean, the incentives to deploy clean energy solutions have never been higher, over these last 2 decades. I think we've become a little bit conditioned by the last 2 decades of stagnant growth, that we've become unable to meet certain load growth as quickly as we should be able to. And so now we have a real opportunity to take advantage of the incentives and the demand to deploy the solutions we have. We've also seen that a lot of these companies, these hyperscalers, have an appetite to invest in some of the new advanced clean energy technologies, whether that's data center flexibility, which we all hope to see come online, but also on the supply side, we've seen a lot of deals with hyperscalers, with advanced nuclear technology companies, with carbon capture and storage projects. And so that really is an opportunity to advance technology today that will have long-term global ramifications for how these technologies progress and how much they're available at an affordable cost for us. So, there's a lot of balancing here to make sure that, we protect certain near-term priorities, but also enable long-term growth. Yeah.
Yeah. And just, as you sort of mentioned at the beginning of your comments, that this load growth is still fairly uncertain, right? So the sort of trajectories going forward for these large loads, on the optimistic side, they're huge, right? But we also have to plan for the possibility that they won't all show up, right?
Yeah, I think we have to plan that they might not all show up. We have to plan that all of it might not also be met. And that means putting in ratepayer protections, making sure that we are not over-investing or creating a certain narrative about, a power supply crunch that isn't real. At the same time, we have to be very serious about some of the load growth projections. I think that can be balanced, but this is a rapidly evolving situation.
Sure.
You hear about new load forecasts every quarter, it seems, and they go up and down. Yep. And so we're all managing this uncertainty together right now.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
I fully agree on your points, Casper, about it's not just a stressor, but also an opportunity. I think in many ways it's a catalyst for not just deployment of cleaner energy technologies, but also of testing and demonstrating integration. So, for example, solar and storage is a great example of integrating those two systems and advancing cleaner technologies simply based on the fact that it's a better option for time to power. Right? It's one thing to say we want to move towards cleaner energy technologies based on some sort of incentives or policies, which is good, but long-term not sustainable and not necessarily scalable. So if it's driven by opportunity, as is with a demand for power for data centers, I think that's a really interesting space for innovation, not just from a technical perspective, not just how do you actually provide the power and can you do this with let's say, setting up microgrids, for example, but also from the perspective of innovations in setting up power purchase agreements and purchasing in general for those. So it's not just a technology innovation opportunity, but also from a general perspective, in integration and agreements and other things.
Yeah, it's great. Okay, so Casper, we talked earlier a little bit about load growth, not just within the U.S., and I know you've thought a lot about sort of global load growth. And so do you want to talk to us a little bit about some common misconceptions in this space, that we all sort of tend to think about things in sort of a North American, European context, but what else is missing there?
Sure. So Clean Air Task Force works globally. We have programmatic work going on in the MENA region, in sub-Saharan Africa as well. I think I'm not sure it's a misconception, perhaps it is we still have a long way to go in terms of global energy access, which means there's a lot of nascent demand globally for new energy supply. I think we have to be very realistic that in many parts of the world, especially low middle income countries, the priority is energy access, economic competitiveness, energy security. So when we think about strategies globally, we have to always make sure we're prioritizing the needs of the different countries and the different societies when we're thinking about how to make solutions more pragmatic, more aligned with those other priorities. And then from a global perspective, one thing that we've noticed in a lot of the energy system modeling that goes to inform global policymaking, there are a lot of remaining assumptions about continued energy consumption disparities per capita across the world. And so if we're truly solving for both climate and energy access and energy security globally, I think there are some assumptions that we frankly just have to update in some of the modeling work we do that then flows on to policy work and a general understanding on what is necessary to achieve our goals. I very much respect, people have priorities for their local local policies, but I also think we need to think about how some of the policy and innovation that we do here is relevant globally. If we can unlock a solution here, or if we can reduce the cost of a technology here, that does have implications globally. And so finding those through lines of what is very high impact work that not only impacts my society, but also has global ramifications, I think was a really interesting perspective that I think we should all kind of more adopt generally as a movement. Yeah.
Even just as a sort of a strategy to de-risk new things, right? Bring down the cost of them and then deploy them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. Tobias, what is one concrete strategy that you think about to sort of unlock load flexibility or to use the load growth as an advantage?
I think, as I mentioned before, I think it's an advantage in many ways as a catalyst for the deployment of these technologies, and there's lots of broader impacts as Casper had mentioned, right? So even if the projections in terms of load growth, even if it falls short of that, with projections, you can either be right or you can be lucky, and even if the load growth is not as pronounced as some of the current models predicting, I think what comes out of it in terms of innovation on deployment of these clean energy technologies, I think they'll have broader impact, not just here, but globally also, as you mentioned.
So that ties into one of our questions that came in from the live audience.
Sure.
So Jason from King Ferry had a question. He said, thanks to Kasparis for your take on the bottleneck of speed and scale, but I see such resistance in our rural communities to even the concept of renewables. If you agree, what work is needed or going on to address this challenge?
Sure. Well, thank you for your question, Jason. Community engagement, early and often, I think is been a somewhat neglected part of the energy transition. And as you point out, it is now materializing in some speed to deployment bottlenecks that we're seeing, not just in the US, but frankly in parts of Europe as well. And in terms of strategies to address this, again, I think proactive community engagement to understand what are the concerns of the community, what are some of the potentially misconceptions that they're having, or perhaps very valid concerns about land use change and development that they have that we need to collectively address to make sure that communities are comfortable with the energy transition. And so a lot of new initiatives are just starting out from my perspective. The governor here in New York has announced an effort to try to create clean energy zones. The specifics of that are a little unclear right now, but to me, that signals a need for not only top-down energy planning, but also bottom-up community engagement to help communities figure out, what is their role within the energy transition. Just last week, we heard an announcement of a very big 20 gigawatt solar development in California in a community that has historically been an agricultural community, but is now suffering from water stress. And so they are seeking new ways to make revenue off the land, that they have. So I will say it's a double-edged sword. There are challenges, but there are also a lot of opportunities. Ultimately, the answer is proactive community engagement. In addition to that, figuring out community benefit agreements that can provide the value that communities are looking for from the transition. No community wants to host a project without their benefit,
Sure.
right? For the sake of another community. So, there is a lot of work to do to figure out what is that symbiotic relationship, across different energy systems with communities. Yeah.
So speaking of announcements,
Sure.
we have another question that just reminded me from Matt in San Diego, who wanted to talk about the announcements for nuclear investments in New York State. Lots of buzz around nuclear power, including Governor Hochul's new announcement this week. Can you talk about the appropriate role of nuclear and the benefits and drawbacks? And that, I think both of you could probably weigh in on that if you like. Who would like
Sure.
to start?
Good.
Happy to start. I think it's a big announcement. This follows on some interesting work that the state did and published in December that provided some power system modeling that showed the role of nuclear in achieving New York's clean electricity targets. I think nuclear is having a little bit of a moment right now where the appetite for innovation and the appetite for revitalizing an industry that really frankly failed, during the last 2 decades during this low growth period is there. So in terms of nuclear, I mean, the role of nuclear depends on every jurisdiction that you're in, but generally it is a clean baseload generation asset that can provide clean electricity no matter the time of day or season. And that has a lot of potential benefits in a whole power system. A little bit of clean, firm power like nuclear has an outsized impact on reducing how much infrastructure needs to be built to achieve deep decarbonization. And so I think you're seeing that be reflected now in some of the power modeling that's being done by the relevant New York agencies. You're also seeing this as a strategy to make power sector decarbonization easier. Right. So not can only nuclear can reduce the costs of the overall transition by having these large outsized impacts on reducing infrastructure build out for a system. But what it also does is that reduction in infrastructure enables us to move a little bit faster towards our goals because we don't have to build as many power plants. We don't have to build as much transmission. We don't have to use as much land or as much critical minerals. And so if you have stakeholders that are interested in minimizing some of those footprints, nuclear presents a really interesting option. Now, the challenge will be building nuclear on time and on budget, which historically the US has failed to do over the last couple decades. Now, we can get into the details. Vogtle was a project management disaster for many reasons completely unrelated to the fundamental technologies. I think generally as a movement, we see success in nuclear build-outs in other parts of the world. Projects that are coming in on budget, on time. So we know it's not a fundamental issue of the technology that it can't be built for a reasonable cost, but it's how we build it. And that muscle we're gonna have to redevelop here. And so it's really exciting that New York is taking the lead here because, again, the learnings and the overall developments that will happen here in New York will have ramifications all over the US in terms of making nuclear a much more viable technology to be built for the transition.
Yeah, and I think that I want to reiterate that point that you made about rebuilding that muscle.
Yeah.
Right. So we haven't built nuclear in the U.S. in so long.
Yeah.
Right. So we're just out of practice. We don't have the skills.
Absolutely.
Which is probably what happened with Vogtle.
Yeah.
So hopefully, we can fix that up. And then the advanced nuclear, of course, being a little bit more flexible, right, with these new nuclear technologies. So it doesn't only have to be baseload, right? As you sort of alluded to, it can provide some of that sort of dispatchable clean firm that we're going to need. So
Yeah.
Okay, so in the interest of time, maybe I'll just move on to the next question. These questions are great, but I'm keeping an eye on the clock. All right, so let's, we sort of started talking about reliability, and we talked about the fact that demand's growing, and so as we're pushing toward net zero, reliability is still sort of the number one non-negotiable, right? And it's not just, as you already said, actually, it's not just about renewables and batteries, though that's mostly what we talk about, what we read and what we hear. The reliability is framed around building enough renewables, building enough storage. So what are the other factors, and I'm not going to list them here, but what are some factors that you think should be more sort of embedded in this conversation around reliability going forward? Tobias?
I think in terms of reliability, and it ties back also to the earlier discussion on load growth related to data centers. I think they present a unique challenge, especially on integration of inherently intermittent resources and storage. And I think advances on that end will have also significant implications on making the overall grid more reliable. So if you couple that with demand flexibility that they're advancing, especially for large loads like that, I think the combination of on the technology side, systematically integrating storage and generation, and then on the demand side, setting up the system such that you have flexibility. I think the combination of those two is going to be quite beneficial to have a more reliable grid moving forward. And I know that's a concern on many fronts with regards to grid reliability overall. But I think if you look at both the supply and the demand side, and flexibility that's built in on that as they're moving forward, I think that's will be interesting looking forward.
I feel like we've been talking about demand side reliability or flexibility, excuse me, for, I don't know, 15 years. What is the sort of key that makes us believe that we're going to be able to hit it now? Is it the incentives that you talked about earlier? Is it new technologies? Is it a little bit of both?
Yeah, I think there's a little chicken and egg here that we're dealing with in terms of assessing how much plausible demand response is reasonable over a certain amount of time. I think in some respects, a lot of the existing demand response programs do not provide enough incentive or accurate enough incentives for the demand to flex in a certain way. So that's one way that we can improve our overall deployment of demand response. Two, I think we still don't have a good understanding of some of the behavioral elements behind demand response. What are customers really willing to provide from a demand response, or what incentives is required to provide that kind of demand response? And then third, I think, as we slowly kind of start getting into more electrification, that ability to flex demand also increases, right? If you have much more electric vehicles, if you have more electrified heating, those are the devices that can enable a lot of the demand flexibility that historically was not possible. And so I think there's a lot of potential. I think there's still a lot of unknowns. And so, when we're solving for reliability, I think we have to be trying to incentivize as much reasonable demand flexibility as possible, testing new technologies, testing new solutions. I think, flexibility in data centers is a really big question right now that everyone is facing, because to the extent that they can be flexible in some of their training runs, that provides a much lower stress to a grid than having just a pure baseload data center. But I think time will tell. We can't bank on it, but we have to aim for it as much as possible, and time will tell.
Yeah. I'm glad you touched on the sort of potential flexibility of data centers, because there's this conversation where, some people say, oh, they're just going to take all the power, and other people say, oh, they're going to flex so much. And so I was curious where you'd come in on that. But
I think time will tell in terms of where we see actual agreements and behavior that reflects that kind of flexibility. Though to the extent that it is there, again, even for the data centers, there are a lot of incentives to connect to grids if you can be flexible. And so, I'm hopeful that these incentives result in much more innovation on demand side flexibility.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so I had one quick follow-up question. So this is like a rapid round.
Sure.
So if you each had to pick one overlooked reliability lever, what would it be? Again, with the magic wand.
I think it would be interesting so in terms of demand flexibility, to make it easier for residential users also to leverage, let's say, time-based rates, right? Whether it's in New York State or the U.S. overall. I think on the one hand, it certainly is beneficial in terms of making it more affordable, but it also there's this additional benefit of generating awareness around energy usage from a residential perspective. I think that would be interesting from a technology perspective. As far as I understand it, there's no significant barriers to make that possible, but from an actual implementation and deployment perspective, there's still some bureaucratic barriers to make that possible. But if I had a magic wand, I think that would be an interesting one to kind of touch on.
Kasparis, do you have one?
So we've touched on kind of clean firm.
You can
so
repeat.
I'm going to leave that one, though I do think clean
Okay.
firm technologies are a very big lever. I think in the near term, I actually think transmission and advanced transmission technologies, grid enhancing technologies, still have a long way to go in terms of being deployed. And I think when people think about transmission, they think about taking low cost wind and transmitting it, to load centers. And sure, that is certainly one of the applications. But transmission and all the relevant advanced technologies around it have a lot of reliability benefits. And so to the extent that we can maximize their deployment, that will also increase the reliability of the system.
That's also a good one. It's often overlooked, yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about bringing this into practice, right? So how do we get there from here? So decarbonization only scales when it creates value. You've both made that very clear. We need lower cost, higher reliability, and reduced risk. And we also know that no single technology wins everywhere. So integration is, basically what you both just said in different ways, is the underappreciated lever, right, in finding real solutions. So we have all these ambitious visions, right, for decarbonization, which are essential. But like when we were discussing sort of this panel ahead of time, both of you a couple of times used the word pragmatic or pragmatism. And so I'd like to explore what that means to you both in the context of actually going from, new technology, from research, from, understanding the problem into actually creating solutions. Which I would say is, how do we move from sort of the ideology to the integration? So making strategies that work across markets, technologies, and communities. Kasparis, do you want to go first?
Yeah. So I've always thought that you can both be pragmatic and ambitious at the same time. I think oftentimes when you say pragmatic, people might think, oh, you're not
Backing away.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the word pragmatic really just reflects, again, society's prioritization for certain characteristics that they require from energy systems: affordability, reliability, and so on. I think we also have to acknowledge that systems have evolved for over a century with different set of priorities that now we have appended. And so figuring out how to make solutions pragmatically fit within the current system that we have is the fastest way to try to provide clean energy solutions. As you mentioned, this is not an ideological puzzle once you get past, accepting the science behind climate change. After that, it becomes a puzzle of how to create solutions that can be integrated into systems quickly. And so, from our perspective, that's always been our strategy. I think that's where also a lot of technology innovation strategy comes from, is trying to create new solutions simply adds to the arsenal of levers that we can pull in different scenarios, and it makes the overall transition more resilient. The one thing I'll add too is, I think there's a misconception sometimes that investors aren't doing enough for climate, or certain types of actors aren't doing enough for climate. And sometimes that has validity, but a lot of times, it's really up to us, the academics, the engineers, the business folks who are in the energy system space, to make solutions that are bankable, that add value, because ultimately that is the way to get them, to be deployed.
Just to build on something that you said in terms of pragmatism being in some sense considered, some would interpret that as if someone says we're going to take a pragmatic approach to the energy transition. There's some that might look at that and say, well, you're backing up on on climate targets by going that route. But I think it absolutely is sort of an axiom of the energy transition that unless it generates value, I don't care what the level of optimism is or what level of incentives there might be, unless it generates value, it's not going to be sustainable and it's not going to scale. So as you mentioned, those two are not, they're not exclusive, right? So you can do the transition in a way in which it generates value, in which it is just simply the better option, the more affordable option, the more reliable option, the faster, the power to scale option is now also faster for renewables than it is for fossil fuels. So I think, quite simply, if you just make the renewables the better, more affordable option, it just kind of goes hand in hand with being the pragmatic solution to get there.
And can I add just one thing as well? That also relates to speed of transition and the different speeds that perhaps different regions, should be assumed to be taking. Again, there's certain regions where energy access is the priority. And so they will deploy whatever solutions they have readily available to get that energy access. And so I think from a global lens as well, I think we just have to be also pragmatic that, the speed and scale of this transition is determined by various other factors that are not clean energy technologies solely. When I think about technology commercialization, wind, solar, batteries are a great success story. But we can't forget that this started, 20, 30 years ago. The Germans were paying something like 500 euros a megawatt hour in feed-in tariffs to get solar deployed on their grids for now our benefit. And so these things take time. And so, to a lot of the young viewers out here as well, I think part of being pragmatic is also not being disheartened by near-term setbacks or near-term challenges. This is a long-term, challenge. It will be a long road ahead of us, and so let's try to stay pragmatic, but also persistent, in our efforts.
Yeah, it would be great if somebody could sort of invest in speed the transmission investment process, right?
Yes.
Which you mentioned was really slow. So that ties into another question from the audience, from Jason, who said, can you speak to the need for transmission capacity, please? How can the grid handle the volume of new central and decentralized generation that we're discussing?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to it broadly. Overall, whether you think climate is a priority or not, just the amount of load growth that we're seeing on the system and that we expect, even from just economic electrification, requires significant amounts of transmission build-outs. Now, the reasons why we've been slow at deploying transmission are intricate, they're very region to region, but the one thing I'll say is it is a very active topic that a lot of attention is going towards today. There are real reforms going on at regional transmission operator levels, at more granular utility levels, that policymakers are trying to sort out. There's not a silver bullet here. And again, there are multiple layers of both planning, but then siting and permitting, financing that have to be resolved. But overall, yeah, we need a lot more transmission regardless of what your priorities are. And again, I'm hopeful that at least today's environment has the incentives to really resolve some of these. Time will tell, whether we're successful.
Okay, great. So sort of following on to the sort of integration and pragmatism topic, right? We all work in partnerships either from academia with external partners or from NGOs and industry partnering with academia. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
So the point being that universities aren't just research hubs, as we all know. So we're academic institutions, but we also operate complex energy systems. And Tobias, I know, would like to talk about how we can operate as living labs. But scaling solutions require strong partnerships, right? Which come in many forms. So Tobias, can you talk a little bit about what role you think academia should play in bridging research and deployment?
Yeah, I think it's several good examples there. So I think first of all, one way to view the role of the university in the energy transition, in not just Cornell, but I think in general, is to provide a platform for folks that are interested in engaging in this, in participating in this, to look beyond the sort of the day-to-day noise of energy being in a polarized political environment. That's sort of a shorter-term disadvantage, but to kind of provide a platform where you can turn your engagements and your passions in contributing towards solutions on that, not just to learn about it, but actually to practice it and to actually integrate it. And there's several examples of that here. So, for example, integration between the academic mission and the facilities mission, which is a centerpiece of Cornell's sort of living lab approach to this, but also integrating commercial partners to this. So creating an environment, basically like an accelerator type environment where startups in this space have access to not only facilities, but also the people that are interested in working on that space. So have access to the technologies that are being developed in the lab and the workforce that's interested in pushing this forward.
Okay, great. And so CASPRIS, Clean Air Task Force, and Cornell Atkinson have been working together actually for the last few years, right? On various energy transition projects. So from the sort of CATF experience, what do you think of as an ideal what do you think an ideal partnership looks like between, your institution and an academic institution, or, with industry? What is the magic bullet?
Yeah, I think there's one view, perhaps misconception of academia, is that academia and universities create knowledge,
okay,
and then passively put that knowledge out into the world for society to benefit. For me, an ideal partnership doesn't look like that. It looks much more active, and it's much more of a two-way street. To create good policy, you need good knowledge. Universities provide a big source of that new knowledge that is created and then used. To your point, industry helps really discipline some of that knowledge for practicality, for real world application. And then us as the NGOs, we observe and take that knowledge and try to translate that to policymakers. But going back the other way, we listen to policymakers and also try to provide cues to researchers like yourselves about what is relevant, what is the most relevant framing, what are some of the scenarios we need to be looking at. And so to me, an ideal partnership is not a one-off project. It is a long-term partnership with discourse going both ways, and that has not only us and researchers in the room, but also industry, policymakers in the room, so we can make it a really dynamic and policy relevant, environment. And so, we've been very thankful and have benefited a lot from our partnerships with Cornell. And we see a long road ahead at kind of continuing that, because again, policy evolves, environment evolves, but that core dynamic and conversation that we create with these partnerships can live on through all the changes kind of ahead of us.
Yeah, and I should also point out that our partnership with you working on energy transitions has been really beneficial in sort of focusing our efforts in addressing the needs of the policymakers, right? So what do they need? What questions do they need us to answer to help inform moving forward? So I really appreciate all the work that we've done. So I think I had one more question for each of you. So for the audience here, maybe you could both answer this if you don't mind. Sure. What's one thing that one or all of us can do either in the near term or the long term to accelerate progress in the energy transition?
I think one place to start would be just so from a user perspective, awareness. I think that's it connects also to what you mentioned earlier in terms of how do you get sort of broader buy-in, and how do you address the issue of having, for example, signs that say no solar on farmland, or having having opposition to the transition because if it's perceived as this is something that's pushed down your neck from let's say federal government or elsewhere, but rather to make sure that there's the awareness around that being the more affordable, the better solution. I think that's one area where there's progress to be made.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think what's been very rewarding in this line of work is energy and climate touches every part of society.
Mm-hmm.
And so wherever you sit, it's likely you can find your connection to both the energy system and also the climate challenge. And so regardless of where you sit, I generally agree about being engaged, being well-read, also being very disciplined about listening to multiple perspectives and assessing, what you feel like is reality. But in addition to that, just in your day-to-day life or wherever you work, it is likely you can find a connection to the energy and climate problem. And so find that connection and find your role in it. I think helps people feel a little bit more grounded, a little bit more tangible, that it's not completely out of their hands. Because at the end of the day, this is a collective challenge. We can do a lot of work that is top-down, that is policy, and so on. But to your point, local communities have to be engaged. And at any part of the community, I think there are opportunities to be engaged. So I would just encourage people to find their connection and find their potential role.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's great. Okay, so I have some more questions from the audience that I'd like to take. So I think this one probably is maybe a Tobias question from Robert in Fairfax, Virginia. Given the reduction in government funding for basic research, what have been the impacts and how are universities like Cornell adjusting to what seems a new reality? It's loaded.
It is.
Give us this one.
It is a great question, but I'll basically quote what Catherine Hamilton recently said on that. It's one thing to look at it in terms of let's say grants from the Department of Energy being cut if it's focused on development of renewables, and that is a concern. But one thing that she had also pointed to is that there's the enthusiasm of the students that are working on it, and I think that goes a long way. They're less worried about sort of shorter term issues with regards to cuts in funding for programs like that, but especially students that you get to work with now, they recognize that this is also in their sort of longer term experience in terms of in the transition and their opportunity to contribute towards that. So they're not thinking of it in terms of like a 4-year time frame. I think leveraging that is good. The other thing that has resulted as part of that is if there's less support from the federal government on that, there's more push now towards trying to find support from foundations and from the private sector. Right? There's I think ultimately it goes back to there's a huge demand for it. For clean energy technologies, and one example maybe to point to would be Bloom Energy, right? If you look at the Department of Energy website for hydrogen initiatives, that's basically blank. But if you look at how Bloom Energy, which is solid oxide fuel cells, and they're targeting a lot also for data center growth, they've grown like crazy over the past year. So it basically just goes back to simple demand questions, right? The demand is there, and then support for initiatives in that space will follow to enable that.
Right. This appetite for energy is sort of seeds the innovation space, right? Yeah. No, that's great. Okay, so we have lots of audience questions. Let's try. So from Tim. He says, considering buildings represent 40% of all energy use in the U.S. and HVAC is 40% of all building energy use, I think a focus on heating and cooling systems is right on target and the largest hanging fruit. Thank you. What technologies for load reduction do Cornell researchers and/or the Clean Air Task Force think have the highest potential?
I can try to address that. So from Cornell's campus as a specific example, and it's a great sort of living lab example for that, but I recognize what we do here may not necessarily translate to other parts of the country, but it's still a great example to address the heating load. For what it's worth, the heating load, the peak heating load for our campus here is 3 times larger than the electrical load, right? So that's an important one to keep in mind just in terms of scale. And the transitions that are very much active there now, for example, to modernize the district heating system, so the power generation and the heat generation, that's a closely integrated system already. Transitioning from steam distributed across the campus to hot water, that's something that's active now, and part of the developments towards decarbonizing campus. So that's a low-hanging fruit. It's not necessarily a cheap low-hanging fruit in that sense, but I think it's definitely one where if you just look at the magnitude of what is the heating demand versus the electrical demand, it's a must-do, and it's happening now. So,
Especially in the Northeast.
yeah.
Yeah. Do you have anything you want to add?
Not much to add on in terms of the technologies. I think historically heating and electricity have been planned a little bit in silos. And so I think from a policy perspective, from a state agency perspective, I think integrating those systems and planning for how those systems will co-evolve over time is evolving and new. And I think that will provide a little bit more assessment of some of the value of some of these integration. And so I'm quite hopeful that, efforts, a lot of which are in the Northeast, in New York as well, on integrating both heating and electricity in planning will provide a little bit more clarity in terms of the value of that and what will result in more incentives and more policy that pushes that forward.
Yeah. Just, circling back to the generating value, right? So if we plan, we can generate value by finding the optimal strategy. But if we find the optimal strategy separately, they're by definition suboptimal, right? And so you're losing value there. So it's just totally inefficient. I think you're absolutely right that has to be a next step to make sure we're doing that properly. I realize now, looking at the audience questions, that we haven't really talked too much about transportation.
Sure.
So Owen from Toronto says, given the increasing share of electric vehicles on the road and in our garages, how do you view using EVs to power the grid?
Yeah, I mean, it's an evolving field.
Yeah.
I think electric vehicles are a very interesting example of what we were talking about before, where new electrified technologies are providing load growth, but are also providing opportunities to manage certain load growth in unique ways. I would love to see more pilot programs at the utility level working to try to see how best to integrate electric vehicle charging dynamically. I know there are also some pilot programs going on in terms of vehicle to grid dispatch, where you're using the battery and rewarding the customer for dispatching charged battery into the electricity grid. I think there's also just a lot of work to do on distribution level electricity planning and optimization to enable some of this to occur. So yeah, all of that to say is there's a lot of opportunity. A lot of the details still haven't been worked out, and I think utility pilot scale projects are a really appropriate place, I think, to put some of this experimentation, because ultimately the planners and the people who keep the lights on need to start becoming a little bit more comfortable with this back and forth, because historically power has flowed one way, and now we're talking about powering the power flowing both ways. I think companies like Octopus Energy in the UK are a really nice bright spot. They've managed to show significant amounts of demand response integration into the UK power grid, providing right incentives. Part of that has also been a very pragmatic approach. Their approach has been make it as easy as possible for the customers, and they've worked with the utilities to make them comfortable. So there's a lot of opportunity there. So we'll see with time.
Yeah. I feel like we've come a long way. I remember when EVs were first sort of rolling out, probably 10 years ago now, and people said vehicle to grid, and most of the people in the energy space or in the electricity space said, oh, that'll never happen, right? Like, void the warranty on your battery, that's the most expensive part of the car.
Right.
And now it's just kind of an accepted next step, right? So we've come a long way.
And globally, the picture is also very encouraging. I mean, here in the US, gas prices are a very big political issue. Globally, in a lot of regions, gas prices are very expensive. And so there are a lot of incentives to try to deploy electric vehicles. You've seen, Chinese electric vehicles be deployed globally at a large scale. So I'm hopeful we'll see a little bit more examples of some of this integration that we can all learn from.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just keeping an eye on the time, I'm going to ask one more question from the audience, and then we'll sort of move to wrap up. So this is from Olivia. You also mentioned that political will is only a small piece of the energy transition. You mentioned other major drivers as industry organization, permitting, and deployment. How would you define the line between what is a function of the local/federal government and what is a function of community organization?
Good question. So the unfortunate answer is it really depends on the jurisdiction in terms of who has authority over certain permitting and siting decisions. However, local community buy-in and local community benefit sharing, I think, can be seen as a precondition to unlocking speed and scale in most regions. And so doing that bottom-up work, I think, is quite relevant. These types of permitting and siting decisions can also, policies can change over time, so the authority can move from the state down to the local community and vice versa. It also depends on the type of infrastructure, which is increasing, also kind of just gets at the complexity of some of this challenge of how many things have to be done. So I would say wherever you are, I think you have to assess your own situation and assess who has, certain authorities, and then go from there in terms of who you engage. Yeah.
Awesome. So I think this is almost perfect timing because I mentioned to you before I have this one last little lightning round for you.
Sure.
So basically this is it. 10 seconds each. Tobias, you want to go first? Last thought. Something you'd share with the audience before we close out here.
I think going 10 seconds. Okay, it should be. I think there's a lot of energy also from let's say the student perspective in engaging in this, and they shouldn't be dismayed or disheartened by sort of current political turbulences, and keep your eye on the ball in terms of the longer term opportunities to engage with this and to contribute to this.
Awesome.
More than 10 seconds. But.
That was great. Thanks, Tobias. Kasparis?
I guess I'll follow on and say the conversations I have had with students here, I feel very optimistic about. They're generally grounded. They actually understand the need to create value and pragmatism, and I think they've shed some of the historical environmental misconceptions, that we're dealing with in policymaking. And so I'm quite hopeful that this next generation will be a large contributor to the solution.
Oh, that's perfect. Okay. So we're going to stop there. So thank you both so much for sharing your insights and your perspectives and answering all the questions. Basically, the major takeaway is that, the path to clean energy future isn't only about technology. It's about integration, collaboration, and action for all of us. So let's sort of keep pushing forward on all those fronts. I want to thank everyone who attended this event and contributed so many great questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to them all. And thanks to Cornell for their support in producing this conversation. And a huge thank you to the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability and the Clean Air Task Force for helping us to put this conversation together, which I hope will be the first of many conversations on this topic. So thank you so much.